left off. We had left off on page 13 or so. Remember that you have a discussion forum post on Jekyll and Hyde due on Wednesday. No class on Monday because it's Labor Day. I'd left off about page 13 where Utterson is beginning to try to understand who the heck Hyde is. And he's beginning to imagine Hyde as this kind of nightmarish figure, this nightmarish imp, this kind of figure who haunts our dreams but never really surfaces in our conscious world. Now let's walk forward a little bit from that. Utterson goes out to meet Hyde and has an encounter with him and starts describing what he looked like, on pages 15 and 16. If you're talking about, Hyde on the quiz, and pages 15 through 16 has some description of him. He's deformed, a picture of disquietude. Has a murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, speaks with a husky whispering and somewhat broken voice. I've also even got some pictures of Hyde that I've been pulling up of some artist renditions of Hyde. Of course, in our story, Hyde is much smaller than Jekyll, but this particular artist envisioned Hyde as much bigger, almost like a Sasquatch. Of course, Hyde has been represented in so many different ways since this novel was written over 150 years ago. Here's Two-Face from the Batman series, which is very similar to Hyde. The idea of a man who on the surface of things, Harvey Dent is a really fine, upstanding citizen, but on the other side has this evil demeanor beneath the surface of things. But of course, with Two-Face, he's permanently disfigured, so you can see both faces of him. This is another portrayal of Hyde in a movie from 1931. Pretty ugly dude right here, slick back hair, kind of deformed brow, giant brow, looks kind of apish, like an ape. I think this would be closer to how Stevenson envisioned him here. You see down here in this other picture, he's got these deformed, kind of apish hands. This one is a pretty scary rendition of him right here. And even we have one guy right here who takes a play on Darwin. And of course, this work happened after Darwin's work began to become famous, and it has some hints of this idea of the evolution or devolution of man. Perhaps we could devolve back to a former self, like closer to an ape. And I think that this has a lot of hints of this new kind of idea at the time of evolution, the idea that science says that perhaps we are derived from apes and we have evolved into humans, and perhaps Hyde is a regression back into something that's subhuman. So I think these pictures of Hyde right here, and then like the Joker, even the Joker in the Batman series, this idea of a man who, becomes something else that might be more sinister. So why don't we take a look? Going back to the text itself, that is in many ways how Hyde is represented in this work. A word troglodytic harkens back to something before, even the dinosaurs, before even humans were around. So something primeval, even. Moving forward a little further. So all of this is to say, we're talking about the quiz. The next quiz has Hyde on the, quiz. And so you can start looking at pages like this to kind of try to start thinking about how Hyde is characterized. Utterson arrives at a solution around page 17 here to Jekyll's problem. He's like, well, this could solve Jekyll's problem. Uh, Surely Utterson thinks that Jekyll is hiding things, uh, like secrets from his past, some things that he's done that he doesn't want everybody to know about, a scandal. And that Hyde knows about this and is blackmailing Jekyll um, in order to get uh, his money and his favors and stuff like that. And he's put into Jekyll's will, and Utterson's fear is that Hyde is going to kill Jekyll and get his money, inherit that fortune. Uh, and so Utterson comes upon the idea that, well, certainly Hyde is hiding something that must be more awful than Jekyll. And so Utterson gets the idea that, well, we should blackmail Hyde. But look at how he arrives upon this idea. I think it's worth noting on page 17 because it says something about the character of Utterson. I mean, certainly Stevenson, Bailey asks a question. You think Stevenson had trust issues because Dr. Jekyll is two-faced? I mean, certainly Stevenson thought many of these same things. Certainly he realized that, people, because he was an author, it was his job to think about, people. And the fact that a lot of times they'll put on one demeanor and be something else. And Stevenson's, one of his most famous novels, Treasure Island, I mean, that's how Long John Silver, he gained the trust of the young boy on that boat. This innocent young boy, he gained the trust of him to make him think that he's a really good person. But deep down inside, Long John Silver was a murderous person who he was a pirate. He's hiding all of these things. So certainly that trend runs through all of Stevenson's literature, and certainly it's something that Stevenson was thinking about as well. On page 17, though, look at Utterson. Utterson looks back at his own past. He brooded a while on his past. And he wonders if, he himself has something that he has hidden that, somebody blackmailed him could come back up. And he says his past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension, yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. So Utterson, on the surface of things, is a really good person, but he realizes that there are some things that he has done in his past which may disgrace himself. And anybody who's honest, none of us are saints, none of us are angels. There's probably something that we don't want the world to know about, or that perhaps we're a little ashamed, of doing. Doing like a second level analysis without, bringing up some of your own sins or something like that. You might think about contemporary events, so recently in the news, I'm just thinking about something I had read in the news recently. You see, Nancy Pelosi was recently caught for, having a secret party in a salon, and this got out, and especially since she has such a strong public stance about wearing masks and social distancing and things like that, it caused a big stink. And so that you could be compared to that right there. Public figures sometimes on the face of things might say one thing, but then do different things underneath the surface of things. And of course, this isn't meant to be, a comment on either party. Of course, I could talk about Republicans as well who had done the same thing. That was just the first example that came to my mind. I'm sure you can think of some as well. So I think this is one of the main things that's going on in the work, is what I'm trying to say here, is that this is one of the underlying terrors of this polite, mannered British society. The fact that underneath the surface of things, we all have these hidden sins, and they're terrified that these things might come to light at some point. at some point, and Hyde represents this. Now, those people who want to talk about how Jekyll changes over the course of the narrative, we've already talked about and established in an earlier lecture how he was the model of an upstanding citizen. But then he began to, he began to withdraw from society. He was scared after the death of Sir Danvers Carew. And then after he finally gets rid of, he decides after this man is murdered, Jekyll does, that he is going to, not indulge in Hyde anymore. He decides he's not going to indulge in Hyde anymore. And so, because he feels like, that was an awful thing to have done, to have murdered this man most brutally. And so Jekyll decides not to indulge in Hyde anymore. And after that, we see how he changes right here. This is on page 28 right here. Once he puts away Hyde, a new life began for Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his seclusion. He renewed his relations with friends. He once more became their familiar guest and entertainer. He was now, and then he's even become more religious. It's like he's trying to make up for his sins. He's becoming penitent. He's like, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. So he's trying to become a better person to make up for his things that he has done. But no sooner than he does this again than does very, very shortly thereafter, just a couple months thereafter, he goes back into this seclusion, even worse, and cuts himself off from society. And we learn later it's because Hyde comes out at a point when he doesn't even take the potion right there. He's just sitting on a park bench and thinking how good of a person he actually is, better than some other people out there. As soon as he starts thinking those thoughts, he turns into Hyde in the middle of the park, and it presents a big problem for him. Some pages that I appear not to have photocopied here, but are worth noting, might be pages 41 and 42. On page 41, if you have the book, this is at the end of the last night chapter. This is where Utterson goes up to break down the door and finds Hyde has committed suicide. And he doesn't realize at the moment that Hyde is Jekyll. He still doesn't realize this. They think that Hyde has killed Jekyll, or Jekyll has went off somewhere else, and they found Hyde, and he's killed himself. And this is another one of the things that this society sees as a really awful sin, and a lot of times would be a great scandal. Suicide. Nowadays, suicide is understood differently than it was for most of human history. A lot of times, modern psychology teaches sympathy for people who commit suicide, like Robin Williams or something like that, or Anthony Bourdain. These are recent figures who've committed suicide. Cats like that are seen as an example that we need to do more to help people with mental health problems and stuff like that. But back in the day, it was a huge scandal. If, for instance, someone in a prominent family committed suicide, it could cause a huge public disgrace. And so a lot of times they try to hide the fact that somebody in the family committed suicide or something like that. So here we see Hyde indulging in another one of the taboos of the time, suicide. He's called a self-destroyer. We also see on page 42 a really interesting thing that's and again, that's in the same chapter at the end of the last night chapter, uh, that in Hyde's room, which is also Jekyll's room, this is the room where Jekyll has basically secluded himself from the rest of the society because he doesn't want anybody to know that he is the same thing as this wanted murderer, Hyde. He secluded himself there, and he can't control any longer, really, when he turns into Hyde or not. And Hyde is basically becoming the dominant personality. He's got a mirror in this room right here. It's called a cheval glass that he looks at daily, and he could see himself in there. Imagine, imagine being you, being James Red, for instance, or Jimmy Red, for instance, and looking in a mirror and seeing a monster every time you looked in that mirror and being conscious of the fact, because Jekyll is conscious of himself whenever he embodies Hyde. Imagine that right there. And how is that significant? How can that relate to our everyday lives? Imagine a criminal, for instance, a person who has, who has done something in the heat of passion. Just something that come up to my mind right here. A man who murdered another person who found, his wife cheating on him. And so he murdered that person in the heat of the moment. Had been previously a very respectable person. And then he did this. And he regrets it. But every day for the rest of his life, he has to look in that mirror right there, and he probably doesn't see himself in the same way that he saw himself before as a dignified person. He sees himself as a monster. Right. So Bailey brings up Frankenstein and how that work also treats the idea of identity. Yeah, and I think some people who struggle with depression as well kind of see that as well. Sometimes people who struggle with depression, one of the things that they deal with is that perhaps they're very critical of themselves, even more so than other people are. And this can, cause a depression. They look in the mirror and maybe they exaggerate the things about themselves that are negative qualities. Um, and so it's a subjective kind of feeling right there. Anybody else want to chime in on this idea of identity and the way that we perceive ourselves versus how others perceive us? I think a lot of these authors in the 19th century were starting to play with this idea right here, from Mary Shelley, and Frankenstein, this idea of what is it like to be a monster? Or for other people to see you as a monster and you yourself not see yourself as a monster. I think about the man, I've forgotten his name, but he was a famous boxer, and he was called the Hurricane. There was a movie that Denzel Washington did about him called The Hurricane. And Bob Dylan wrote a song about this man as well. All society saw him as this murderer, this man who brutally murdered a person, but he was actually innocent. And he proclaimed his innocence, for 20 years or so. So all society saw him as this evil murderer. They were grateful that he was locked up in prison, but he saw himself not in that way. And it turned out that he was innocent. He actually didn't kill that person, and eventually he was let free. So it's interesting to see how public perception can be flawed. Yeah, and I think in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this monster is portrayed as a mental disorder, and you could probably see that as well in a lot of monsters in horror movies nowadays, like a banshee uh, could be, portrayed as a woman who uh, is suffering hysteria or something like that. Uh, it's pretty common in horror that they'll use monsters to represent like our most exaggerated mental illnesses and stuff like that. Michaela wants to talk about page 52. Um, are you talking about when Lanyon sees Hyde? Is that what you're talking about, Michaela? When Lanyon first discovers Hyde? In my edition, that's on page 50. And that was a page I wanted to talk about, so maybe we can get back to the text. Yeah, and Dara says she agrees with Deja. Sometimes we have to be honest with ourselves to understand the problems that occurs within. We have to kind of be able to see ourselves in a mirror, to imagine ourselves uh, and who we are and how others perceive us. And sometimes I think it helps if we can perceive ourselves in a better light. I think it's really interesting to think of that mirroring aspect right there and how that has to do with identity. Jekyll constantly, as you read his final chapter right here, he disassociates himself from Hyde. He says, I am not Hyde. That is a different person. But, I think he's struggling with it because ultimately, like I said, that's the same person, from my public judgment. But I mean, Jekyll has a different has a different conception of himself. Yeah, I think you're kind of right. I mean, I think that look at how Lanyon reacts to viewing Hyde and recognizing that Hyde and Jekyll are the same person. It kills Lanyon. It basically drives him into the grave. Uh, and that had to have affected Jekyll as well. This is the only person alive who, saw him for what he truly was. And that had to have hurt Jekyll a lot. Um, I think the thing that, of course, drives Jekyll insane more than anything else is that he's losing control over his own body. He's no longer able to control when he can move back and forth. So when he loses control of his own body, it causes this traumatic experience, this mental trauma right here. Who am I? And so in a lot of ways, this work explores, how much it can hurt. Mental trauma can be caused by this idea of who am I? Questioning your identity. You could compare it to there's a lot of things you could compare this to. Like think about a gay person growing up in a strictly religious household, for instance, who might have been told, you know, grown up thinking that it's, and of course, that like my church freely accepts gay people. Of course, I'm not trying to call into a question any different type of religion or anything like that, but just imagine, I'm sure we've all know somebody who has grown up that way. Uh, like my father grew up telling me that, if you're gay, you go to hell, stuff like that. I don't believe that, but imagine growing up in that type of household and then realizing at some point, well, I'm gay. Uh, I'm attracted to men. And then you are told from one hand, you're an evil person. And then from the other hand, uh, you're like, this is me. This is my natural inclination. So that kind of mental trauma causes a lot of, teenagers to commit suicide, uh, and things like that. And so this could be compared to that as well. All right, so I think we've kind of gotten off track a little bit, but I'm happy to keep talking about things like this if that's something that interests y'all. But there are some other passages that I'd like to talk about in the work as well. I'm really enjoying this discussion. Is there any other second level connections y'all can think of besides like this? What I'm talking about, we're riffing on the thematic topic of identity, like a split identity. People who try to hide one aspect of themselves privately versus publicly. We're kind of talking about the mental trauma that can cause and how that relates to this. Yeah, I mean, I think that like divorce, for instance, can cause a person to question his or her identity. If somebody, if you love somebody and then that person, you know, doesn't see you in the same aspect anymore, doesn't see you in the same light anymore, that can cause a lot of identity issues. Sometimes in divorce, we see split families, and let's say there's a child stuck in between, and you've got one parent over here, the father, and then the mother, and then they're all talking about each other, and the child is in between right there, and the mother might be saying these bad things about the father, and the father might be saying these bad things about the mother, and then you've got this issue with the child here is faced between how do I really see my father? How do I really see my mother? And that can cause trauma as well. You're going to have to refresh my memory on the body dysmorphia. What is that, Michaela? Like people who feel that their body is disfigured? I'm also not familiar with the movie Split, Deja. Can you tell me a little bit about that? While y'all are typing a response right there, I'm going to bring up some other passages I think that we should probably start talking about. Um, we'll get back to that in a minute. Let's take a look at the chapter on Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Um, this is on page 52 here. If you're going to look at the character of Jekyll, this chapter is the most essential chapter. It is Jekyll's confession. And in this page right here, we see what he's like at the beginning of his life. We see that he's got a great fortune. He's got all the things. He's got a good upbringing, a moral upbringing. He's got all the things that a good person in this society should have. In order to be successful, they believe that if you have these aspects in your life, you are set up to be a success and to be a good person. And he says, and indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. So Stevenson leaves his pleasures deliberately vague to kind of let us use Jekyll as an everyman. To imagine any person who might be hiding something from his past, some sin or taboo that society looks down upon. But of course, scholars have had a field day, speculating what that means. You could look at that word gaiety right there. And even back in the day, that could possibly have something to do with having sex, with men with the same sex. Uh, and that could very well be one of the things that Jekyll, was doing. He was going out, and maybe he's gay. I mean, he's not married. He doesn't have any kids. And of course, back in the day, that was seen negatively. It was something that you could go to jail over. Um, that might be one thing, or it could be drug abuse, because definitely Jekyll abuses drugs in this work itself. It could just be having sex out of wedlock. It could be any number of vices. Uh, it could just be he's going out and making fun of people, something as small as that. Uh, but it's left deliberately vague. It could be just about anything, but it's not. It's something that is bad, but probably isn't the worst thing that could be done. He hasn't murdered anybody, yet. um, but the key thing right there is he's talking about his two-faced persona that he's developed at an early age. This idea of how I'm going to look like toward the public versus these pleasures that I want to indulge in that the public looks down upon, that I don't want them to know about. And he says from an early age, he's had this right here. And he's lived this life, yet he's allowed one aspect of his personality to take over and be dominant versus the other. And we see how this sets up the idea of Hyde coming into the program later. Let's see what some of y'all are saying up here about some of these other things y'all wanted to talk about. So Michaelia talks about body dysmorphia, when people look in the mirror and see themselves as being bigger in weight than they actually are, so they starve themselves and come upset with their body. No matter how skinny they are, they'll always see a big person in the mirror. I think that that's a valid connection as well. Of course, that's one of the horrors that Jekyll experiences, is he looks in the mirror and he sees something. He sees Hyde, which is this something he hates about himself. Okay. And he has to see that every day. He has to live with that every day. And then gradually he becomes sicker and sicker as this narrative goes on. So I think literally Jekyll's body is disfigured. So it's definitely something you could relate it to. And then multiple personality disorder, this idea is a real mental illness that could be, like this work is something seminal that could be studying people who have multiple personality disorders. So we're talking about, uh, I believe it's Split is what y'all were talking about, and you're saying like he kidnaps some people, some girls, and their reaction to him causes his monster personality to come out. Uh, okay, I can see that relation. Okay, so Dara brings out the facts about slavery, and of course in America, but of course slavery been present all over the world since the dawn of time, pretty much. And this idea that you own another person, uh, but in particular in America, the slave owners sometimes it's been it's been documented, would rape their slaves, and they'd have children with their slaves, um, and they would suppress this news. Nobody would know. Maybe people knew, but they never talked about it really. Um, and so, on the surface of things, you look like a fine, upstanding gentleman, um, but underneath things, you had these awful tendencies that you take out on your humans that you owned. Um, that's an awful thing right there. I mean, Thomas Jefferson famously, had some kids with his slave as well. Okay, Let's keep looking at the text a little bit more before we run out of time. Again, like I said before, this is the most important chapter in the work, and it's because we get the reveal ultimately. It's a study on the type of person who wants to indulge in these pleasures that society says he can't indulge in, and what happens if he's allowed that ability with impunity without being punished. He is able to concoct a potion that allows him to adopt this other visual identity where nobody associates him with Jekyll simply because he looks different. And so he allows himself to indulge in these pleasures. It's a study on social repression as well. You can see, like, Hyde, think about symbolically what Hyde represents in the way that he's formed. Hyde in this novel is much smaller than Jekyll. And it's because he represents these taboos and things that Jekyll wants to indulge in but has repressed. And so thus he's like literally pushing himself down into making himself smaller. And so this aspect of his personality is diminished in figure, but it's still very powerful and passionate. And eventually, the more Jekyll indulges in these fantasies, the stronger it grows and eventually overpowers him. So there's like a message that the more you try to repress these things, sometimes these natural tendencies, the stronger they become sometimes, or sometimes we lash out because we repress these things. And any psychologist worth his salt will tell you that nowadays. You know, if you're holding down something that bothers you, if you repress it, then sometimes sooner or later that's going to come out, and it's going to come out like a whip. It's going to be fast and furious. If, for instance, there's something that bothers you, it's like somebody pushing your buttons. You know, you just sit there and try to take it and try to take it, and then one day things are going to come out, boom. And that's what happens with Hyde. Jekyll tries to suppress Hyde. Okay, he says after Hyde takes things too far, he says, I'm not going to indulge in Hyde anymore. I'm not going to do that. But then one day he lets down his defenses and he takes the potion. And that is the day, after Hyde has been suppressed so long, that he goes out and murders this man so violently. And he just beats the carcass until it's unrecognizable of Sir Danvers' crew. So these things are going on about the narrative as well. We see some of the reasons why, as we go forward on page 54, why Jekyll likes to dawn on the aspects of Hyde. And this is at the beginning, just as Jekyll has been. You could think about it like drug use, okay? I think the closest drug I can compare this to would be like methamphetamine or something like that. Imagine, you know, a meth addict. At first, it might allow the person to be reckless, to feel free. He no longer has to be bound to the obligations of social mores and bonds. You don't, any drug, you know, or a lot of drugs will give you a kind of freedom of consciousness to do things, or even alcohol. You know, you take, you have a couple beers and you feel lighter. You feel like you can say things. A lot of people who have social anxiety won't have that social anxiety anymore. And he's got this freedom of the soul, that so he doesn't feel bound to his conscience anymore, is basically how it works. Hyde is not bound to his conscience anymore. And so he delights in the evil that he is allowed to indulge in. We see on 55, it says, the evil side of my nature to which I now transferred the stamping efficacy was less robust and less developed than the good which I had deposed. So that's why I was talking about how Hyde is physically smaller than Jekyll. And this is one of the most famous quotes out of the work right here on page 55. He realizes why other people are so disgusted by Hyde. It's because all human beings are commingled out of good and evil, but Edward Hyde alone in the ranks of mankind was pure evil. So that's why people are so disgusted in them. It seems like the work argues that clearly we all have both of these aspects, but our ability to have a conscience, something that was given to us, in the story of Genesis by God, to allow us to distinguish between good and evil. Those folks who don't have that are like pure evil. Okay, I'm going to have to continue the rest of this discussion next time, but there's only a few pages left here for me to kind of pick apart a little further. Start thinking about your journal